Chapter 32. Hell. Gideon's consciousness returned sooner than he expected it to. With each felled monster, the malice he reflected from them seemed to pass as soon as they did. His semblance wasn't perfect, but it at least got him here. The doors were large, and he was hoping to have broken them down instead of having to push, but here he was. He tested out the bionics under his armor that compensated for his fluctuating levels of strength and motion that Dr. Nebo built to prevent his semblance from hurting him. He leaned one shoulder against the door and moved to push it with the force of the machine rather than his own. It began to pay off as the door slowly began to open. He suddenly took notice of the fact that the door he wasn't pushing was also moving at the same pace. He paused a moment and saw the door continue without his effort. They were opening on their own. He wasn't sure whether to be embarrassed or concerned that he might be expected. Nevertheless, he was here for a reason, and made his way inside. After taking several steps, the doors began to move again, causing Gideon to take up a guarded stance. He began to look around to make sure the building wasn't occupied by more than those he was expecting. No guards, no weapons, just broken and aged art, furniture, and... He drew up his blade when a lone woman entered his field of vision. She was pale as an aged corpse, yet full like a maiden in the prime of her life. She exhumed an aura of confidence and quietness that almost seemed to resemble a character from fantasy. He kept his sword pointed at the tip of her nose, lest a weapon reveal itself and the need for a quick parry become apparent. She looked down at him from her balcony and silently made her way down the steps. He moved in pace, keeping his eyes on her dress to compensate for the fact that her feet were unseen. His armor noisily added tension to the room as her robes wisped aside with wraith-like grace. It was as if he was in the room alone, and his movements were the only thing giving life to their surroundings. Even the thunder outside was muted by the walls that reflected their maker. Beautiful, yet with a color palette that communicated a silent threat. He was treating everything accordingly. "Are you the witch?" Her eyes remained closed as she continued to move down the steps to greet her guest. "I'm here to prevent you from coordinating any more grim attacks on the Four Kingdoms." She remained silent and almost unaware of his presence. "Do you have anything to say before I end this?" She began to move closer and closer to him without yet acknowledging him. "Please don't make this harder than it has to be. Abimelech is dead." She continued without a sound until passing him by and making her way towards the door as if she was on her way to answer someone who knocked. Letting out a sigh at the possibility that he may have only encountered a servant, he took careful steps to the side while examining the obsidian ornaments that hung from her pearlescent hair. "Do you serve Salem?" "I was sent by Headmaster Ozpin." At that word, her head turned sharply and the air was sucked from the room. Her eyes were now open and fully locked on him. Gideon was expecting consciousness to pass and the nightmares to begin. He was expecting to come out to find the mansion leveled and her ruined corpse to lay among the rubble as the living witness of her own heart turned against her as the destruction she wrought on the world revealed to her and to discover her strength wanting. What he wasn't expecting was to see her eyes. As black as pitch with an aura that resembled smoke emanated from what he saw now were blood-red irises. They fixed on him, and Gideon felt nothing. No strength, no fury, and certainly no malice. She simply stared at him, waiting for the inevitable to come with a furious expectation. It was when he finally matched her eyeline and focused his strength that he started to see what was happening. "So you've done your homework. You know how my semblance works. Preventing malicious thoughts won't save you." Gideon moved to grab her arm and saw a motion that matched it. His free hand instinctively made to counter the blow, only to find her hand held out like some Atlian noble expecting a kiss. His blade didn't move, and he couldn't figure out why. He failed to understand why she was exposing herself like this. He took the hand and tensed his shoulders to bring his blade down. A long moment passed as Gideon held his stance with her hand cusped in his own and holding up his blade, ready to end her life. The stillness in the room finally passed as Gideon's breathing began to quicken and his body began to shake. His sword arm dropped as his strength left him, and while still holding her hand, he fell to one knee and could barely bring himself to lift his blade. Thoughts flooded him as his consciousness matched her own. Every single moment of desperation and shame amplified and resounded through his own attempting to mirror the soul that now stood before him. He knew the effects of poison. He had sparred with people whose semblances caused enfeeblement. This wasn't anything more than his own semblance doing its work. And with the burden of eternity on a soul separated from hope, life, and light, Gideon let out a cry of despair that could only have come from the depths of hell itself. Gideon was lost, but not in malice or fury. He mirrored the soul of one accursed from life itself. An existence forsaken, the single thought, desire, and hope that resounded and rebounded through every fiber of his being pleaded with him for an end. With the weight of eons of agony and desperation merely caused by his own existence, a voiceless cry began to struggle as this moment passed like a life age, as he drank in the full and undiluted cup of this woman's despair and pleaded for it to end. He once again met her eyes, looking for even an ounce of pity, as the presence of another acknowledging his pain could be found as comfort. Yet it was at this moment that true malice was seen in her soul. Whatever could have found pity, and even empathy at the fact there was now another in the universe who knew exactly what her existence, separated from everything good, had become. He saw that it was now gone. The absence of this last shred of human conscience wasn't much, but enough to fuel a single stroke from his blade. He could pity her, and now lifted his blade in mercy, ready to end her forsaken existence. He forced the blade up, biting into flesh. Her garments parted between her breasts, welcoming the sundering of everything that sustained her lifeblood, and her heart burst from the blow. The agony continued as tears streamed from Gideon's face. He openly wept in gratitude that he could bring peace to such a burdened creature. Though it was never a weapon he wielded lightly, death in this world wasn't something that had gone wrong with life. It was rest, and the continued burden of sharing Salem's soul was considered the greatest kindness he could have done for anyone in this world of contradiction and paradoxes. He took in a sharp breath, wondering why her body hadn't fallen. Using whatever strength he could muster, he rolled back his shoulders to see her lifeless and at rest. Instead, he saw her continuing to stare at him, with the blade protruding from the center of her chest. Despite the sharp protrusion, it still rose and fell with the same accursed breath that kept them both here. He let the force of gravity remove the blade as his body weight angled the weapon out and eventually back to fall onto the floor. He watched as the moment his blade left her sternum that bones reknitted and the flesh concealed it. Not even a scar remained. Salem finally let his hand go and opened the door to see him out. With heavy breaths, he slowly made his way out of the castle as his strength returned to him. Her eyes sneered at him without any malice apart from her own nature that he now carried with him as devoid of hope, peace, and meaning. He used his blade as a cane to steady himself as another thought passed through his mind before losing consciousness. Maybe this world was too. With no good or God to ultimately define it, he couldn't look at anyone or anything in this world anymore in light of a simple reality. "Where is hope?" he croaked before seeing 3 familiar figures running towards him. Another tear passed from his eyes when he saw those he knew the most, who had to share the pain that the truth brought to this world. "Where is hope?" he cried wordlessly, as they began to gather him in their arms.